20 years is when this journey first started for me individually in 2004. And of course, and that brings us up to the present, kind of brings it full circle with the background of the family narrative and the origin of Wari and then the ultimate creation of CASE21 and what it is that we want to accomplish with other Black homeowners. So my brother's here. Is he still here?
Yes. He's in the back.
He's in the bathroom. Oh, you just let him. You can come back. You don't have to go find him. So I did want to talk about. So I did have there's another reason why I had a picture of my family. My grandmother passed in 2020. The entire estate went into probate because there was no will, which I would say was a good thing. And that I could probably explain why I think that's a good thing. But it did go into probate, and that provided an opportunity for Wari to be a resource to partner with the family to potentially save the homes, right? And so in 2020 or 2020, mid 2020-ish, Wari did launch a capital campaign to appeal to the community that was interested in helping the family save the homes, and progressively over the course of 2 years, raised in direct donations $1.6 million, and then raised an additional $2.4 million in the form of a city grant from Program Strategic Investment Fund, which I think is being managed by the department. Michael is our grant manager over there for the land conservancy. But what that was able to do is that allowed myself and 3 of my siblings to really begin to think more expansively about what the possibilities were for saving these homes, right? When I talk about I've been involved in this journey for about 20 years, I'm going back to the moment when the first time one of the homes was in danger of being lost. It's a long story, I won't get into it. But from that moment on, it was clear that for those of us in the family that were interested in continuing, the work and the desires of Frank and Golden being my grandparents, that we would have to take it upon ourselves to come together and start to really think about what could we possibly do. Unfortunately, those of us who were doing that work were not in the direct line of succession as it pertains to inheritance, right? So our legal rights and abilities to affect change were not direct. And so, we were constantly thinking about, is there a way that we could, collectively come together to buy one or more of the houses? Of course, as you know, just sort of mapping that, looking at the housing market over the past 20 years, there was a moment where, regardless of our professional, successes, there was no way that we could keep pace with the valuation of properties, right? Every time we were positioning ourselves, we got a new county tax valuation, and every year there's going up $50,000, $75,000, right? And so, it began the prospects began to look increasingly dire, but this was going to be something that we were going to be able to do. But the founding of Wari, all of the work that Wari was doing and Wari being very intentional about messaging that this is an art intervention that is an anti-displacement act for artists, made it clear to the community what our intentions were and what issues we were endeavoring to resolve in the process of doing this work, right? And so in doing so, it allowed for Wari to have a series of conversations with members of the family to talk about how can we make this work, right? And so the ultimate outcome was that the funding that we were able to raise as Wari, which was routed through our fiscal sponsor, Northwest Film Forum, and was a combination of direct donations from individuals and foundation grants. Help support the formation of the Franklin Golden Agricultural Land Conservancy, which is a 501c3 organization with set. Ibiade Sek, Tony Wakoma, and myself, India Wakoma, and we're all city, right? We're the founding board of the Franklin Golden Agricultural Land Conservancy. It is the Land Conservancy, which is the recipient of the grant from the Strategic Investment Fund. So that coupled with the capital funds that were committed to Wari, helped both with the formation of the Land Conservancy, working with two different law firms and both different people, and figuring out how to structure it legally and how to structure a partnership between one and Wari, to get us to the moment where when the property went into probate and were up for market sale, that the Land Conservancy could place humanity bids on the property, right? And so then what that means is that it's successful, and there's still some legal hurdles that have to be crossed before that is a real thing. But when and if that does happen, what that means is that those two properties will perpetually, one, be owned by an entity that was founded and will be managed by family members and other stakeholders, because we have to think about our 501c3 charter, right? The IRS isn't counting on families, doing things like that. But it's just, that's kind of a legal kink. As it pertains to the city grant, those properties will be in public service for the next 20 years, right? Okay. Wari will continue to be an anchor tenant in one property, and most likely will be a programming partner at the second property, which the vision currently is to convert the second property into artist studios and artist living spaces, right? Okay, and then to affordable spaces, for Black artists, predominantly Black artists, to really something to live there and others to have their studios in that property, right? So it's a transformation of the nature of ownership, right? And it pertains to us as a family, but we are expanding our sense of what it means, to be stewards of the vision laid out by our grandparents' generation. And we're also, experimenting actively with how do we have conversations with other Black families about what's possible, right? We do know that, the solution that we came up with was very complex, right? It involved a lot of pieces, there's a lot of hurdles. We were able to accomplish it because we really did come together collectively, and the work that Wari started, and the sort of the values that Wari put forth in why we exist, really communicated to folks that we are about doing collective work in doing this. So the fact that, we were collecting a solution around instead of all the family, I think is meaningful, right? So, but we want the conversation with other Black families to be generative around what's possible, and understand that people will have a multiplicity of solutions that they may be thinking of that will be, look very different than the one that we came up with. But ultimately, we have to be thinking about how do we, in the way of thinking that, in terms of farming or agriculture, how do you prep the land to receive, the thing that we want to have, right? And for us, that starts with the policy environment, right? It has to be support of those things, otherwise, nothing will grow. So I think that this is the mission of the Franklin Golden Agricultural Land Conservancy. Creates new opportunities for Black community building by promoting land ownership models that prioritize cultural placekeeping and access to affordable cultural spaces and housing. So that's our official mission and charter as it pertains to our 501c3 status. Did you want to say anything?
You said it. Well, I don't, I guess this is part of a continued legacy, with the hope that I think it's already been successful. Like he said, if and when, you know, this whole thing is all wrapped up, those who paid close attention or were part of kind of the build, hopefully will have a blueprint of how this work can be continued with other Black families who are looking to kind of acquire and hold on to family or homes that were inherited to them, as a way of combating displacement. I think this was a hell of a hook. I mean, I don't know who thought of it, but I mean, I always tell people we're not recreating the playbook in any way, kind of taking what's already there and making it better. And kind of rewriting a language that is easily digestible and comprehensible, and a blueprint that can be replicated with other Black families, I guess, is the hope. So, yeah, start a trust.
So these are two homes. The top one obviously is the house where Wari is, and the other house is the house where my grandmother lived. My grandparents lived, and then most recently my grandmother. My grandfather passed in 2010, by the way. So that's kind of what precipitated a sea change, because he was the one that was directly involved in managing all of the properties. I mean, he made decisions with my grandmother, but she worked at Swedish Hospital, and he retired in the early 70s, and pretty much all he did was, you know, manage the properties, and he also did like contracting work. You know, he's a member of Mount Zion. So I don't know. Are there any questions or anything like that you know about anything that we've talked about so far? No. Yes. Yes.
So many questions.
Absolutely. Please bring them on. Bring them all on. Yes. Start anywhere. Yes.
But I guess I mean we might get to this later, but it sounds like you had ample support from community resource, from fundraising and grants and the strategic fund. So I'm curious, like when you say policy, and then also I want to mention, you mentioned like policy is really where you want to start with this kind of community visioning. And is that all, like, for someone who doesn't really know much about the policy portion, maybe you'll get into that. How, like,
when I say policy,
yeah,
what do I mean?
Exactly. Okay,
so here's an example. So just super basic. We had a house, 911 24th Avenue,
yeah.
Right? And the people that were living in it is zoned as what's the RSL, residential small lot. That's the new zoning, right? That's the new zoning designation. Now, what that means is that based on the land use code for Seattle, somebody can live in that house. That's all they can do, right? You can have a small business in the house, but it can't be discernible at all from anyone outside the house. You can't put a sign up. People can't hear you doing your business. They can't smell you doing your business. They can't feel you doing your business. They can't know that you're doing business at all in your house at all, which means you can't have people lined up outside your house for your services or any of those things, which would be considered a code violation, right? So if we're looking purely at how the zoning laws work, right? That's one example of like public policy that I'm referring to, right? And then, you know, in order to change that, you know, what Wari was able to do was to get a change of master use permit, which changed the zoning for this single structure, not the whole, because this property has 3 livable units on it. This house here, and then there's a sort of a mother-in-law duplex at the back of the property, right? The permit changed the use of just this house into a community center under what's called an administrative conditional use permit. Okay, so I'm just saying that, you know, one example of public policy is restrictive zoning in the city of Seattle. exclusionary zoning in the city of Seattle, which says that in this area, all these properties are zoned this way, and use is restricted specifically for these types of things, right? Now that this house has been zoned as a community center, it's illegal for anyone to live in the house, right? So for some reason, you know, something happened with Wari and it like shuttered its doors tomorrow. The property owners, which at this point technically legally is me, right? I'm the administrator of the estate. But for instance, I could not rent this out to somebody to live in it, right? I'd have to find someone who was using it for whatever the sort of designated, you know, zoning use is for this house right now. Or I would have to go back to SDCI and say, okay, we need to change it back, right? Which, right, so, you know, so I mean, I guess what I'm saying is that, you know, this is where, you know, if you understand public policy, if you understand how all the suite of laws, and you understand how to navigate them, you know what's possible. The next thing is what's possible accessible, right? The third thing is what's possible practical. Is what's possible going to get you into another bad situation while you're trying to fix the initial bad situation, right? And so if I were to look at this purely objectively as just the administrator, not as, you know, also a member of Wari, I'd say, man, if you guys like don't work, I'm screwed, right? I still have to rent this house out. If you guys don't keep paying rent, if you shut down, you know, the next person that comes along, you know, who am I going to find? What other organization am I going to find to pay $4,000 or $5,000 a month for this house as is, right? You know, to kind of help keep moving things forward, right? So, you know, I'm just talking about this one example to describe, you know, what we mean in terms of public policy, but also another example, right? So there are 2 mother-in-law units in the back. Those are still, there's no conditional use permit that applies to those 2 units, right? People can still live there, right, in the back 2 units. If we wanted to turn those back 2 units into community space and use them for something that was being openly and advertised as community use, that would be illegal, right? It would be illegal first because the permit only applies to the one structure, right? So there are ways that, you know, it's just, you know, just sort of outlining, just using that one example, what we mean. And I'm just talking about the zoning laws and how in our particular case, how the zoning laws apply, right? And so if you know, if there's another black homeowner that's on our block 4 houses down, right? Then they're like, oh, we love what you guys are doing. We want to be a part of the cultural ecosystem, right? Well, if you go to SDCI, they're going to say, well, there's another community center within 300 feet. We can't allow that. You see what I'm saying, right? You know, it could get super. I can get super technical in terms of all the things, and I know these things because I had to do them and answer all the questions and go through it with the architects and the attorneys and the reviewers at SDCI. But the point is that there are ways in which these things don't support community-wide solutions, right? You know what I'm saying? Which is why I'm always very specific about Wari being sort of a demonstration model of what's possible more broadly and not necessarily as something that is prescriptive as a solution for other black homeowners, right? And that bringing black homeowners together to first learn about, well, let's look at all of, you know, as much of the, you know, the housing and land use policies that are on the books now. Let's spend time in actually understanding what's out there so that we know what the landscape is. How is the soil composed? What can we actually grow? What can we do with it in as is state? And then let's start to imagine what could be possible if we changed. For instance, extending the analogy, if we change the chemical and mineral composition of the soil, if we change the policy landscape, what could we do, right? You know, so starting with that, what could we do point of view, you know, which gets us into the other work that we've been doing which is, our survey work with Black homeowners. And so we've spent the past, 2.5 years creating a community engagement model around doing qualitative and quantitative surveys with Black homeowners to begin to gather that hard data for us to actually understand, what folks' needs and priorities are, right? And that's a precursor to us. It happens simultaneous to our community building work, but it's also a precursor to us actually doing the real nuts and bolts policy work that we want to do with the folks that we're convening and community building with. So, I mean, there are a bunch of other examples that I use, but I feel like that's probably one that is illustrated best with our situation. Yeah. And then there are other things like property taxes, right? Which is a big one, right? Which is another, sort of, bread and butter and a much more immediate sort of policy. A lot of folks don't look at it as a policy challenge, but it is, right? People think of it as a financial challenge, which it is, but it's also a policy thing. There are things that people, we in the community can actually be engaged in to move the needle one way or the other, as it pertains to how our homes are taxed, right? And which materially affects our ability to just live in it on a day-to-day basis, right? So these are the kind of things that we want people to be materially engaged in. I think, people sometimes, some folks are aware of senior exemptions when it comes to property taxes, right? Which there are some new developments on that front. But we want to be thinking much more expansively, right? So, just to sort of deconstruct some things, right? Let's say we brought together Tia and I'm sorry, what is your name?
Patience.
Oh, you're Patience. I saw you on Zoom. That's why I didn't recognize you. How are you? Okay. How's it going? How you been? Good. So, Lolita, right? Yes. So let's just say Tia and Lena, right? Let's say one of you wanted to, say you had 2 cousins that were artists, and you wanted to start your own gallery. Your house was down the block, right? Well, there's the initial challenge of the house is just being too close, right? But you're grappling with the property tax issue. That's one of your main concerns, right? But first of all, understanding, how the property tax thing works. One of the things that we know about Wari, is, once you structure your entity properly and you are actually running a legitimate cultural institution, there are actually tax benefits on the state level, right? That can, if you have, if your ownership and your relationship to the property is properly aligned, right, that can impact your property tax bill, right? But you would have to get deep into sort of all the polys to actually understand that that's an opportunity, right? Or to even look at that and say, wow, that is an opportunity that is so down and deep to kind of excavate it. You know what I'm saying? We actually need to figure out how to make that a little bit more accessible, a little closer to the surface, right? And so then those are questions and things that we can begin to look at. We can start to have conversations with state legislators. We can start to have conversations with folks, in various, I would say in state government, the Department of Revenue, other departments around some of these important, questions, as Black homeowners around a specific set of goals that we want to accomplish, right? That are based on our priorities, right? And so I'm using that just as an example. It's probably not the best example, right? But it's an example of saying, okay, once we have sort of convened ourselves as Black homeowners, once we begin to really start to understand how these laws work, once we begin to understand what our shared goals and visions are, we sort of come up with a set of policy priorities that we want to pursue. Then we can start to think about who do we need to talk, who we need to talk to, how do we strategize, how do we begin to move forward to make some of these changes. So that's the direction, that's the focus where we want to head, with CASE21 specifically. But I think just as a moment of segue, would you like to talk about Uplift?
Yeah, I thought.
Okay, here. Well, and I want to do this because I want to illustrate that there are folks doing other work that's critical to the success of Black homeownership retention. That is not the work that we are endeavoring to do, but we have to be able to do this work alongside one another, right? And so to be able to hear from Caleb, you might be able to illustrate that a little bit.
Thank you. And I came here as a Black homeowner today, but Uplift is a part of what I do. Before I get into it, I love, like, one of ours is my favorite organization I come to and like learn from, just because of the high level of thinking. I took notes. I don't even know if you know you said it, but that, is it possible? Is it accessible? Is it practical, right? So like, I Uplift our diversity or statement or mission statement is inequitable resources is a primary tool of oppression and systematic racism. We want to reverse that, right? Because those resources, even though they're there, they're not accessible, right? And if they are accessible, they're not practical. We can't go and talk to architects and things like that in our community, so trying to reverse that is what we're doing. And so I heard that, probably gonna use it, I love it, you know what I mean? But like, those are examples of like just the understanding of the problem and the solutions that are important. So I want to say that first off. I'm with an organization called Uplift Investment Group. We have a program called Resource Equity, and what the program's North Star is Black wealth, right? We are focused on Black wealth and decreasing the wealth gap, right? And I think that's important because we're not aimed at the poverty line, we're aimed at the wealth gap. And we can do that, we believe we do that through ownership. And so like a lot of our stuff, we say, if it's not ownership, if it's not ownership, it's not one of our solutions, right? Because we really want to retain and promote ownership in our Black community. So that's our North Star. How we do that with resource equity, we have a program where we help homeowners understand what they can do with their property as far as like development or renovation wise. We do that through our we call it 3 pillars. Through those 3 pillars, we give homeowners what we call their unique wealth vision, right? The first pillar is knowing the homeowner. It's the first pillar and it's the most important part. I got on a call with, I'm gonna segue a little bit, sorry. So my dad's a pastor, right? And so I got into this work 4 years ago because pastors like to talk, and my dad would keep telling